how it all got started. It all got started with strategic planning with my board of directors. And, we all, as a conservation organization, of course, we've been aware of climate change for a long time. And we have seen impacts already over decades of climate change. But the real question the board was struggling with was, what should be our role, right? What should the Conservancy do? What can a regional organization do, given that this is a global issue? And also, our plate was very full. And so, really, could we take anything more on? And yet, there was sort of also a sense that if we didn't get involved and use our assets to help advance the issue, we'd be abdicating our responsibility as a science-based conservation organization. So, the first thing we did is we came to the conclusion that we're not going to do this alone, and that we needed to find some strategic partners that we could work with. Then Irma hit, and that was the wake up call for this entire community. And I think the first thing that happened was it really struck me that we have to stop talking about this as an environmental issue at the regional level, and we had to shift to talk about this as a community issue, because one of the things Irma taught us was that more intense, higher frequency intensity storms are going to hit our area. And Irma proved that. So reached out to Eileen, who I have a wonderful collaborative working relationship with, and we've done a lot of things together, and said, I think we need to do this climate change thing as a community-based issue. And the first thing we did is we did a survey. We partnered with Eco America that does surveys all across the United States. And we did a survey, and the survey results came in, and they were pretty astounding. Remember, this was at a time where there's still a lot of climate skepticism, there's much less so now, but at the time it was sort of considered very controversial. But let me tell you, after Hurricane Irma, people started connecting the dots and seeing impact to their quality of life, impact to their community, and the connection between climate change and the incredible intensification of storms that we continue to see today, and what that means, not just sea level rise, but what does it mean to our health? What does it mean to our community? Think of all the nonprofit leaders, or all of you in the PR world. What happens to your clients when Naples shuts down for 18 months? I mean, we dodged a huge bullet. There could have been a 10 to 15 foot storm surge rolling right through downtown Naples. Imagine what that would have done to our downtown, to our economy, to our community, to all the people that are employed. So I called Eileen. I said, we need to do this thing. We need to position this as a community issue. And Eileen says, I'm in. And so that sort of led to that connection. And then we felt this really needed to be regional. And so the next call was to Sarah and said, the impacts don't stop at the Collier County line. We are all, as a region, dealing with the same thing. And so Sarah from the Southwest Florida Community Foundation, who I also have a great working relationship with and a lot of respect for, I said, Sarah, we need to do this thing together. We need to bring the region together to understand and educate people about what climate change is, from a language and a position that everyone can buy into and understand how this affects my home, my community, and get away from the polarization side of the debate back then. And that was really sort of the birthing of Growing Climate Solutions. And with the partnership from FGCU, because they were also doing great work on climate change. And then with a great matching challenge grant from the Kapnick Family Foundation that Eileen was instrumental in, we onboarded, and they asked that the Conservancy be the administrative overseer of the partnership. And that's how we got to where we are today. And very grateful that we found Anna as our first senior regional director. And I guess the rest you'll hear about today. So that's sort of the genesis, I guess, if you want to say it that way.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Now I'll turn it over to Eileen Connolly-Kiesler. She's the president and CEO of the Community Foundation Collier County, and she will share a few words about her role in growing climate solutions. Eileen?
I guess I have to unmute. Thanks for having us here to talk about this. And obviously, when we looked at it from a community foundation perspective, I'm sure many of you had seen the needs assessment that we had done about 4 years ago now. It was definitely fresher when we started looking at climate solutions. But one of the 5 top things that came up that people were concerned about in this community was water, and what is going to happen to our water. And what are all the issues that affect our water. So we already had that piece on our radar. And then when the Conservancy said, hey, we're going to do a bigger study and take a look at it, we were at the table on that. So it was fairly easy for our board at that point to say, here's an opportunity to help create this growing climate solutions. And we already know the community wants it. So at the time, and this was a couple years ago, the Community Foundation did a $300,000 grant, which was one of our biggest grants we had done at that point for a project like this. But we were excited that it was going to be regional and that all of us were going to be at the table together on this. So the board 100% supported it. It actually, at the time, you know, you think we're going to deal a lot around water. That was, I think, my first when we envisioned or when I heard about this potential project. But actually, it's kind of interesting how it has even morphed beyond that, because the Community Foundation has raised $500,000 for trees and called Your Passion, Your Collier, our campaign. And actually, this is all worked together because trees play a really important role. And when Cindy had mentioned restoring our earth, that's what we're trying to do with this project, is put all these trees back in place that Irma took out when she came through. So there's been some collaboration and crossover with Anna and Climate Solutions around trees, which I probably would not have envisioned a couple years ago when we started this. So I think that we're just going to continue to see more and more and more projects that overlap, that come together, and we're going to be there along with everybody else that's working on this to make sure we can get it done in our community. So that's why we're here.
Great, thanks, Eileen. Sarah Owen is the president and CEO of the Southwest Florida Community Foundation and the Collaboratory. Sarah, tell us about your organization's interest in this initiative.
Absolutely. Well, I think I'll echo much of what Rob and Eileen said. I won't repeat those kind of things because I support everything they said. But, you know, for us, it began with those phone calls that Rob mentioned. You know, part of the idea of creating community and regional solutions is you pick up the phone or answer your email when your partners reach out and say, yes, I'll go with you, right? There, instead of starting your own thing, what can you do together? So we really came at this in a spirit of collaboration and a desire and willingness to be at the table and kind of model that. The other thing for us was this whole idea of community engagement. You know, climate for so long has been either controversial, political, you know, people want to do something. Our region is a region of action, they care, and really helping people understand in everyday terms what they can do. I actually think the people on this call today are the keys in many ways to what we're talking about, the communicators, the public relations people that are working in the community every day with your clients and helping people understand that climate isn't like this thing you add on to something, but it already exists in everything that you're doing. It's tied to economic development. It's tied to your business strategy. It's tied to your corporate social responsibility plan. It's tied to everything. Everything you're working on right now on your desks has a tie to climate. But how do people know how to plug in? So we were really interested in being part of a collaboration that was led by science and experts, but had this whole community engagement piece. So it's really just an honor and a pleasure for us to be supportive while some really hardworking, very smart people are doing the heavy lifting. So it's great to be part of the collaboration.
Great. Sarah, Rob, and Eileen, thank you for your leadership and commitment. Now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Anna Puzskin-Chevlin. She's the Regional Director of Growing Climate Solutions, Path to Positive, Southwest Florida. Anna has an extensive background in the areas of sustainability and planning, serving as the Sustainability Officer for the City of Delray Beach. She is well-versed in the areas of climate literacy, resilience adaptation, and education. She earned her doctorate and master's degree in urban planning from Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anna Puzskin-Chevlin.
Well, thank you, everyone. And I really appreciate you taking your time and your lunch hour to learn more about climate. And today's presentation, I'm going to share my screen, is about climate and communication. So it is titled, and let me know when you can all see it. Everyone seeing the screen? I hope that's a hands up. So it is titled Communication, Climate, and Collaboration, because I think as I've been learning more about this topic, that communication about climate is key to making it happen. And as public relations professionals, I need your collaboration to do that communicating. And this is the beginning of perhaps a very fruitful discussion. So there is an old adage that people say, never talk politics or religion in polite company. Well, how about climate change? Can we talk about climate change? And for a long time, it's been very difficult, as Rob said and Eileen noted. We don't talk about climate. So today's presentation is a bit about where is the community sentiment on climate and how does that impact the message? We'll also cover like a primer on what's driving climate and what are some of the impacts, because as we ask people to communicate, they kind of have to know the basics of the science to be able to talk about it. Then I will briefly discuss my approach and how I communicate climate and mostly the solutions. What is the role of solutions? And I hope to engage you so that together we can move this discussion forward. So where do we start? Well, we start by looking at the data. And as Rob had mentioned, a lot of Growing Climate Solutions initiatives started with a survey done by Eco America. And it was done in 2018, and it applied to or asked 800 people in our 5-county area their opinions and attitudes toward climate. But it isn't that data alone. Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton on the other side, they started doing a climate survey that is statewide. They've asked about 1,300 people statewide their opinions and responses to climate, both in 2008 and 19, in 20, and now they're doing a 2021 survey. So we have that statewide data. And then there's also Yale University's program on climate change and communication out of Connecticut. And they do a national study that includes 25,000 responses. And what's lovely about that is that they actually break it down by county and city and have beautiful maps. So I encourage you at one point to sort of explore that website. And what that together, when you pull all this information together, you start to get a sense of where we really are on this climate issue. So how many people really believe in climate change and what's causing it? According to the statewide data and the Yale climate data, about 55 to 56% of Floridians believe that climate change is happening. And they believe that it's anthropogenic or human induced. It's human activities that are driving climate change. What's really interesting to start looking at are the two other numbers, the 16 and 28. So the orange figure is how many people believe climate change is happening, but it's not related to human activity. It's natural causes, volcanoes or tilt in the earth or increased solar radiation. And that number can be somewhere between 16 and the statewide data showed maybe 34%. So it shows that there are quite a number of people that believe climate change is happening, but they're not really sure about the science. And the other piece that's interesting is this discrepancy between 28% and 11%. These are people who flatly don't think climate is changing. So what do we do about that? Well, let's dig a little deeper. The Eco America data tends to support the Yale information. It says that about a third of the population, 27%, don't believe that climate change is happening at all. That's astounding. And about 2/3 believe that it's happening, but a hefty 20% think that it's induced by natural causes. Let's break that down by county. In Lee County, Collier, and Charlotte, somewhere between 33% and 36% of people still in 2020 do not think that climate change is real. And that causes a certain spiral of silence. If you are going to meet somebody and you don't know if they're in that 33 or 36%, you are not likely to broach this discussion because you don't want to engage in that controversy. So what we find, even in the Eco America data, is that let's say we say 76% of people now agree that we have to take action today to reduce the greenhouse gases or the pollution causing climate change. The data shows that only 30 to 35% of people are willing to discuss the topic of global warming among friends and family. And that really steers how the discussion plays out when you start to talk to folks. So what happens? When you don't think that many people agree that climate change is human induced, you focus on trying to find a common ground. So we have 2/3 of the people that somehow agree it's happening, regardless of what's causing it. And that leads us to focus on adaptation. What are the things we can do to prepare ourselves for this eventuality? So we look at changes in land use, or we need to be more prepared for emergencies. Our businesses have to have a plan what to do next. We have to upgrade our infrastructure so we don't flood. But we don't deal with the root cause, which are the greenhouse gas emissions that are causing the warming. So we don't talk about this mitigation discussion. These are changes in energy uses, renewable energy, the need for sustainable transportation, ways to capture that CO2 and bring it back into the earth. We don't want to talk about this because we're afraid of that confrontation with the person that says, well, there's nothing humans are doing. And I disagree with this fundamentally. While it's nice to talk about adaptation, we must talk about both, because until we deal with mitigation, we're not going to deal with the root cause. So I often begin my discussions with basic science 101. You have to put it into perspective. Many people in our region didn't take earth science, or it's been a really long time, and they just may not quite understand the scientific underpinnings, which are, not disputed. This is physics. So we quickly review this graph or this diagram put out by the IPCC and NOAA. And it shows that the sun emits electromagnetic radiation, sun rays, that travel through space, some of which hit the atmosphere and bounce off the atmosphere into outer space. Some of those sun rays penetrate the atmosphere, and then they hit the Earth's surfaces, but they reflect off of a shiny thing like ice and snow on the mountains or on the North Pole or on Greenland, or even white roofs, and they bounce off through the atmosphere into outer space. The rest of the sun rays hit the Earth, and when they hit the Earth or the water, they slow down their frequency and they get re-emitted as longer wavelengths called infrared. That's the light lamp over the French fries, the infrared heat. And some of that escapes the atmosphere, but much of it is captured in the atmosphere, in the water vapor and in the gases that comprise our atmosphere. And they get re-radiated to the Earth, keeping us nice and warm and toasty. And that's called the greenhouse effect. Hopefully younger people are learning this in science class, but for many of the people we talk to, this lack of understanding doesn't make them connect the information that they need to address climate mitigation. So we start here. And from there, we have to explain that as modernization has happened, as industrialization has happened, we've changed those gases. So when we go from a horse and buggy to cars commuting on highways that are burning fossil fuel and emitting CO2, as we've moved our manufacturing from mills that were on the river and powered by hydro or by water to electricity that's produced by burning oil or natural gas through fracking, as we've moved from agriculture that is plowed into the land by a horse and a mule to industrial agriculture, which is then shipped, the produce is shipped in refrigerated containers all over the globe. What we've done is change the composition of that atmosphere. The gases are in the atmosphere, the percentages are changing. We're creating a warmer blanket. And this little graph shows you that, yes, we've had changes over, let's say, the last 2,000 years in the concentration of these gases. But look what happens at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution and the 20th century. The changes really accelerate. And now we have a way higher concentration of these gases. Let's look at some other very simple charts, this one done by Scripps. Here is the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, 1700. Slowly, we start to chug up the amount of CO2. And then by 1950, when modernization happens, not just in the US where everyone starts acquiring a car, but cars become ubiquitous in developing nations and all over the world, and factories start developing all over the world. Here we start to see a shoot up in the CO2. And by 2018, we're at 409 parts per million. And then you get the climate question saying, but hasn't the CO2 always changed? Hasn't the Earth's atmosphere always accounted for variability in those gases? And yes, it's true. And here is where the perspective of how long it's been and how much is really important. On the graph to the right, you see that CO2 has had peaks and valleys over the last 800,000 years. So over 800,000 years, CO2 goes up and down because of natural causes, but never in that entire geological history has the amount of CO2 gone above 300 parts per million. But look where we are, let's say today. In December of 2019, we're at 411 parts per million. Never since humans have walked the earth, or humanoids, in the past 20,000 years, now 20,000 versus 800,000, never has the CO2 gone above that 300, and now we're at 411. And as of April 3rd, there was an announcement that at the Maui Observatory, the CO2 levels had reached 421 parts per million just this month. So does that convince people? A lot of charts and graphs really don't make the connection. So what I tried to do is connect this discussion to what's happening here in Southwest Florida. How are you feeling these impacts? Are you feeling them? And last year in May, a friend of mine in the Washington, DC area sent me this text. It's snowing in May. And I captured that to keep it. I've walked in downtown Delray, and here you see the seawall in the intercoastal, and the water has gone underneath during the high tides. And here in Southwest Florida, if you go to Southern Collier County, you'll see that the mangroves are receding back on those islands. So all of these are connected to climate. So how do we make this real for people? As we mentioned, we go back to the data. The Eco America data suggested that people here really connect to the fact that climate will impact natural assets. 93% agree that the government needs to do more to protect our mangroves and wetlands. A healthy 2/3, almost 3/4, agree that the algal blooms are getting worse because of climate change. Almost 80% in that survey said that sea level will threaten our communities, and hurricanes really register. 83% of people agree that extreme storms such as hurricanes will affect our community, and climate is related to that. Irma being a driver, 67% were more concerned about climate after Irma. So those are really good indicators of what are the messages we have to connect with. Let's look at the FAU data that's statewide. And this was really fascinating. FAU directly asked people, what concerns you most about climate change? And on this graph, yellow is they are extremely concerned, and gray is they are moderately concerned. Blue is that they're not concerned at all. So what are people really concerned about? Drinking water. Drinking water was the highest extreme concern. And then you can partner that with what's next, the health of the natural environment. These two are very important. What's interesting, what they're not worried about, they're not worried about flooding from rain. They're not worried too much about drought or sea level rise. And what that tells me as an educator and person focused on climate literacy is that they see these issues as kind of individual, and they don't make the connections between these issues. Because if you're worried about drinking water, then rain flooding should concern you. And that's how I try to pivot my message. Let's talk about this. And I explain this to you because the more literate you are about these impacts, the more you can talk about them with others. And I weave these discussions together in a particular way. So we saw that graphic about where are those sun rays going and where is that CO2 going? And about 90% of the heat that comes to Earth and about 30% of the CO2 we've emitted has been absorbed by our oceans. That's because we're an aquatic planet and oceans cover a large majority of our planet. And that is, of course, where we start to see the impacts of climate first. So coral bleaching is a phenomenon that occurs when the coral get weak and die, and they get weak because the water temperatures are rising. There are more nutrients and pollutants, and the CO2 has made the water more acidic. The pH level has changed, and that makes the corals more susceptible to disease and to die off. And we first saw this in Australia, but now we're seeing it right here in Florida, because we've seen stony coral tissue loss, which is a disease of the coral, start in around 2014 in the Miami area. This map, which is 2019, shows that the entire eastern seaboard is now impacted by this. And so are our clams, and so is the diversity of all fish, because the corals and the estuaries, they're the first level of the food chain for the oceans. And when we have issues here, it works its way up the food chain to our fishing industry, to our boating industry, to our tourism. Also, as the water temperatures get warmer, we get sea level rise, in part because warmer water expands, as in the Bunsen burner experiment you did in 9th grade. As the temperature goes up, the volume increases. And also because of polar cap melt. And now the melting is actually a bigger part of the problem than the expansion, though they go back and forth. We have been losing 10% of ice every decade. And that may not sound like a lot, but there is a feedback mechanism that is really dangerous about this. And it goes back to that understanding the science. If those rays hit the poles, but we've melted the ice, there is less of the ice to reflect back that electromagnetic radiation and move it out of the atmosphere. In fact, as the sun melts the ice, it reaches the ground and it starts to melt the permafrost on the poles. And the permafrost has a lot of CO2 and methane that's been frozen into that layer of earth. And as we melt it, that CO2 enters the atmosphere and it creates a feedback loop. So we have two issues with sea level rise. One is we're adding more water. Two, we're increasing the volume. And three, we're releasing that permafrost and more gas. And that means the sea levels will rise exponentially. And this is a discussion that is really important. Sea levels are not going to rise in the future. They have already started to rise. So since 1950, we've had 8 inches of sea level rise, and that rate is accelerating. It's not a linear equation where you learn, the slope is straight. It's actually an exponential equation. So once it gets going, it accelerates. So over the past decade, we've had about 1 inch of sea level rise every 3 years. What does that mean to us here in Southwest Florida? That means that by 2030, we're going to have perhaps 9 to 15 inches of sea level rise. And by 2040, somewhere between a foot and maybe 2 feet of sea level rise. This is data right off of the St. Petersburg buoy. There are certain buoys that NOAA tracks, and this is the closest one to Southwest Florida. And with sea level rise, what is at risk is a lot of property value. And property value, not just in terms of what you and I own and how much it's worth, but also property tax, because it is those property taxes that keep our local government going. It pays for the firemen and the policemen and the water. And if those property values go down, then local government will have less revenue to both provide services that affect your quality of life and to invest in the solutions. So how much is at risk? Quite a bit. In fact, 100 zip codes in Florida have more than 40% of that property tax base at risk to sea level rise by 2050. Naples, Sanibel, and Fort Myers Beach rank 10th, 26th, and 32nd in the United States in terms of the amount of property value that's at risk to inundation of sea level rise. It doesn't have to go underwater completely, but if 26 times a year, your street is impassable or you have water on your driveway, that's not going to let you sell your house for the amount of money that you think. And in fact, that price deflation is already perking its head. A study that was done just before COVID, so let's exclude the bubble, the real estate bubble as a result of COVID. But right before COVID, they already started to see a 7% decline in property value for properties that are at risk of inundation versus those just a half a mile inland that are not at risk. Let's turn to the issue of that rain and flooding, that issue that didn't really poll well. People weren't too concerned about it. Well, we're already seeing more extreme precipitation. What that means is that with climate change, we're going to have wetter wets and drier dries. And we've started to see that. In Collier County, 2 or 3 years ago, we had 17 inches of rain in 24 hours. And we've also seen those dry spells and brush fires. And if you're not impacted by the flooding or the brush fire, then what I try to do is relate it back to the triggers that I think are important. We know people care about the natural environment. How about those birds that migrate here? If there is no water and we have a drought, then those birds will not have the wading habitat for the food they need to eat during their migration journey. We may lose those species. I also know that water quality is an important issue. Let's relate the flooding to what happens to water quality. When it rains like that, a lot of the fertilizer on those lawns gets pushed into the canal system. And as the canals drain out and the water gets warm in the canal, we have these harmful algal blooms. So the algal blooms that we see that impact our beaches and our tourism, they are indirectly related to the precipitation and the fertilization. Not only that, when it rains really hard, septic systems, older ones in our county, and we have those, they get overwhelmed with that kind of rain. And then all that E. coli bacteria floats up to the surface because the ground soil just can't handle that water. And if it can, and it goes into the storm drain system, and then it floods a lower income area or a low-lying area, this water is not rainwater. This is polluted water. Not only does it carry with it what's in the storm drain and what's on the streets, but then the garage that gets flooded, the apartments. What's in a garage? Oil, motor oil, fertilizer, pesticide, all of that gets into this water system, and it is not safe to walk in that. And when it does drain out, it drains into the storm drain and out into the bay, and that hurts our estuaries. So all of this is connected. One of the biggest connections I think people do not know, and I always try to explain this, is saltwater intrusion, because we are concerned about our drinking water supply. How do you connect water supply to climate? Well, saltwater intrusion is a real concern, and most people don't even understand this concept because it's happening under your feet where you can't see it. So as we have homes on this land, we draw water from our freshwater aquifer through wells that dig down and draw water. During a period of a dry spell, and as we pump more water out because we waste it or we don't use it, or we have a lot of population growth, new homes, this water supply will become less. And the interface between the salt water that's under the Gulf of Mexico and the freshwater, this line will start to move ever inward, landward. Likewise, as we have the oceans expand and we have sea level rise, this water line will also move landward, which will also push the saltwater interface closer and closer, to these wells. And at the point where the salt water touches the bottom of the well, we have salt water in our well system, and we have to either cap that well or desalinate or move the wells inland, which is really expensive. So now people start to understand that we need to recharge this aquifer constantly and allow water to get in. We need to keep salt water at bay. We need to preserve the aquifer that keeps our quality of life and our water drinking supply. We know that hurricanes are a trigger. So as the temperatures get warmer, the hurricanes will hold more moisture. For every 1 degree of temperature change, that hurricane can, or that air mass can hold 7% more moisture. So hurricanes are going to get wetter. Hurricanes are also going to get stronger because warm air and warm water fuels those hurricanes. And instead of getting several category 2 and 3 hurricanes, which us Floridians, we're like, yeah, that's a bad rainstorm, let's just put up the shutters. we're going to start seeing more category 4 and 5 hurricanes, which bring with it all the evacuation and that destruction that really can put a community out. And when you combine stronger storms and higher sea level, that means that the storm surge can go further inland and be more destructive. So it's really important for people to understand that the hurricanes of the past will be nothing, will pale in comparison to what might be coming in the coming century. Another impact that is important to drive home is heat. And right now, people don't talk about heat. Talk about more about water, but heat pulled pretty low in that survey. And that's because most people haven't experienced it. But according to scientific modeling, where we used to have about 26 days of heat index about over 105 degrees, by mid-century, that may be half the year. Imagine half the year with heat and humidity over 105 degrees. How is that going to impact season? At the beginning, we were talking about, is season over? Well, if the season is going to start or be shorter, all that economic dollars that those people spend will become less. And people may migrate north earlier in the coming century. Who's going to, even residents who've been here over the summers, if we're going to get a lot of hot days, they are going to be going north. And what's that going to do for our summer economy? In fact, Fort Myers, Naples, and Punta Gorda rank 5th, 6th, and 8th in the United States in terms of the cities that will experience the most number of danger heat days. And it's hard for people to understand that that may happen in the future. But let's talk about what's happening today. This year, and this headline comes from just 2 weeks ago, the iconic cherry blossoms have bloomed earlier in Washington and in Japan than in the past 1,800 years. So we are seeing our spring season start a little earlier. And what that does, it creates warmer temperatures that makes trees bloom earlier and makes our allergy and pollen season longer and worse. In fact, the pollen is even more aggressive. Heat will also impact the number of poor air quality days in general, leading to more asthma attacks, more respiratory distress, and more cardiovascular disease, heat strokes, and more insects, bugs that carry dengue or Zika. And this isn't distributed evenly. It really impacts vulnerable populations, the elderly who may have trouble breathing, children who are prone to asthma, children of color who have a much higher incidence of asthma than the average white child in the United States. It also impacts our workforce. How about the people that are fixing those roads? The person that's changing your roof, the gardener, the pool person that comes to clean your pool. These populations are going to be adversely impacted, as are households with less money, because they may not have the air conditioning to feel comfortable, or they may have to ration their air conditioning not to be stuck with a high bill. So the heat impacts are going to become a growing concern. So let me take a pause now and say, what does Growing Climate Solutions do? Like, what is my role? My role, and what I hope our organization is about, is enlightening people and building climate literacy. The discussion I just shared with you should be general knowledge among our population. 2, we want to protect our natural assets because they are a really good buffer toward climate resilience. We want our stakeholders to empower community leaders to do the right thing, take the right climate actions, create the resiliency in our communities today. And as they move investments in pumps and flooding, in purchasing land, in preserving trees, we want to make sure that that's equitable, that it helps all members of our community, not just affluent pockets, but everybody. And we want to celebrate when people are doing the right thing, because there's nothing more powerful in the message than showing what somebody else is doing and having other people join in that discussion. So those are the 5 principles that Growing Climate Solutions has taken on with the support of our community Foundation partners with the information and leadership of the university and the Conservancy and the guidance of Eco America. So what I try to do is depoliticize this climate discussion by building a broad coalition of partners, insurance companies, banking institutions, doctors, faith leaders. The more those people engage in the climate discussion, the more we depoliticize it and make it okay, raise that 30% of people that talk about it. We want to use those partners like today to speak to other organizations and groups that can spread the message. We also want to focus on solutions, and that's the next part of this discussion, and how to engage everyone in daily changes and how to elevate those daily changes to systemic change. And finally, we want to empower everyone to talk about it. So building the literacy is key to elevating the discussion. And I'm going to show you how it works. So we start with you today listening to this discussion. And if I can persuade you to do a couple of climate actions and really engage, you might, and you in your household, reduce your carbon footprint, let's say by 15%. And that is not a lot. That's not going to fix the climate challenges. It's not the systemic change, but it's really important. And what's important about it is that you do it, have the personal experience, and then communicate your personal experience to others. Whether you started sneezing earlier because the pollen was there, or you started eating meatless Monday, you share that with some of your friends. And it could be your bridge club or the people you golf with. It could be your book club. But what happens when you share that information and those people trust you is that now they may try that new product that you tried, and they may share it with their family, and then their family starts using that. And slowly local businesses see that niche. There's a niche for these consumer products. They open up a store, and then slowly we change consumer demand, and businesses pick up on that. And this is where the marketing people really start to play a role, and they start creating more products, and there's more products in the market and more people try it. So yes, that is one of the consumer market approaches, but there's more to it than that. What's more to it is that one person in that group, they may be at the helm of their company or in a leadership position, and they see that they can bring a practice to their office. Maybe they don't recycle well. Maybe there are a lot of people driving electric vehicles, but there's no place to charge them. And they convince their company's leadership that it's good to be green, that it's going to attract people to their business. It's a good branding. And they then educate all the people in their company to recycle better, to eat vegetarian, because bean patties were offered in the cafeteria. Okay. And now somebody tastes it and now they try it, right? It also means that somebody in that group may be a politician, be married to the next city council person, be next door to that person, and they share what they did, whether it's they started a garden or they don't like the way the recycling is being done. And that leader then brings that policy to city government. NGOs, you may volunteer to work for one, and they help bring pressure with that or support that politician that brings that change. And then everybody goes to church on Sunday, whatever denomination or temple you go to, and you find that there are others in your church that are in a green sanctuary committee. And suddenly from this person talking to you, you engage with this group, and all of these people decide to support this legislative change. And so this is how we elevate personal ideas to systemic change. It's through communication. And we know we need to do that communicating, and marketing people and PR people are really important. They do this green branding. They make those employers take on a green brand as part of their identity. They push these products as how green they are and get it out to the general public. They support these local businesses that are making a go of it. So you are an important part of this communication piece, and you're an important part of bringing the systemic change, because going back to the data, we know that in Florida, only 28% of the population believes that government is doing enough. 38% believe that government needs to do more. And if you dig down into the FAU data and into the climate data done by Yale, it's really interesting. When we talk about government, we talk about state and local government. And where we look at it, what's really interesting is when asked if your governor needs to do more, less than 50% of the people believe it's the state's responsibility. But when the question is asked as to whether local government must do more, that is where we see more than 50% in Lee County, in Lee and in Collier County. The onus falls first on local government. So that is where we get the traction. So what is this traction? I'm going to give you just a couple of examples so that you can bring these ideas forward. So every time you make a purchase, whether it's energy, transportation, food, water, you are making an energy and climate decision. And what we need to do is make people understand that those decisions should weigh what are the energy and resource issues involved in that purchase, and how can that purchase either reduce your carbon footprint or how does it affect the life cycle of that product. Let me bring it home, let's say with transportation. So transportation is an important sector. In the state of Florida, 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation. The average American produces 50,000 pounds of CO2 every year. 20% of that is from their driving. So we can teach people and push the messages to conserve fuel, to work from home because you're not driving and you're not, creating more vehicle miles traveled, to fly less often, or when you're making a purchase, look at electric or hybrid at least, and maybe take your bike or walk, take public transportation. As we have started to embrace, let's say, electric vehicles, this is Ford's new Mustang. It is electric. Electric no longer looks like a lunar module. It looks like a car, a cool car that people want to have. Bikes have improved, and now we're seeing electric bikes. And so where you wouldn't pedal necessarily, you might take an electric bike. And these are the personal changes that you can take. And when you do that and you share your experiences, suddenly you might realize that riding a bike isn't so easy in Southwest Florida because the roads are dangerous. We don't have a road infrastructure that accommodates golf carts that are electric or bikes. And what we really need is to look at our road infrastructure and build it differently. This is a picture of a complete street. It has wide sidewalks so that you can walk places more comfortably and look in windows. It has a protected bike lane that's shaded by trees. They have bulbed out the intersection so that an elderly person can actually walk from one side to the other in the time of one traffic light. But normally people don't engage with that. Only when they've started to change their transportation choices do they realize all the other systemic things that go with supporting that choice. And now they might be an advocate at an FDOT, Florida Department of Transportation, meeting about widening a road. They might become an issue voter on that. Likewise, let's talk about food. Everyone loves food. We've heard that people should eat less meat and eat more veggies. It's important to know why, because nobody likes that. So if you're communicating on this, the reason we need to eat less meat is, one, cows belch and fart a lot of methane. About 4% of US emissions are related to beef production. But more importantly, the amount of resources to make a pound of beef is really high. It takes 25 pounds of feed, in fact, 1,800 gallons of water to produce a pound of beef. Compare that to chicken that takes 4.5 pounds to make a pound of chicken. So this kind of resource intensive food leads to deforestation. It leads to people in Brazil burning down the rainforest, right? Also, the positive end to that is that eating more plants improves your health. It improves the economics for local farmers. It's less expensive to your wallet. So these are all positive messages. The other message to push out, waste less and grow more. So you're less likely to waste the tomato that you grew in your garden because you can't wait to pick it and you really want to taste it. When food is produced in a mass consumption, it's easy to throw it out. And we throw out about a third of the food that doesn't make it from the farm to your fork. Food that gets thrown out is a waste of money. It produces methane emissions. So when you waste less, you reduce methane, you conserve more energy, and we support local farmers. And when you do throw things out, maybe we should make composting cool and sexy. People have this ick factor about composting because it's associated to waste. And it's really easy to say, oh, let it go away through the waste management system. But it's really helpful to take those complex organic carbons and not burn them at a landfill or bury them where they produce emissions through an anaerobic process. This is my composter in my yard. If you compost, you can take that compost right to your garden. Keep it on site. You don't carry it, you don't transport it, you don't use fuel for that, and your soil and your plants will be fertilized without chemicals. And by the way, that helps your water quality. And we really know that people care about water quality. And once you start to get into the food ecosystem, you will then see that regenerative ag is just a step away. We can change the regenerative ag, we can fertilize less, we can have better water. Likewise, natural assets and plants and trees, people love to plant. It's very good for climate change because it reduces the ambient temperature, it captures carbon dioxide. The roots actually help the water runoff, helps that water go down into the aquifer. And trees provide bird habitat. But it's more than just you planting the tree. Talk about the trees with your neighbors. Get them engaged, because what we're trying to do is elevate that discussion so that people care about land regulation and conservation. Finally, and I know I'm running a little long, what are the next steps? So what gives you joy? What are you good at? And what needs to get done? Look for the nexus between these three things. And if you're a gardener, try composting and try planting a tree. If you like to cook, try Meatless Monday, share your recipe. If you're an exercise fiend, try riding that bike or maybe pick up scuba. Finally, communicate all of these things to friends and family. That's really important. Write about it, talk about it, use the gift of your pen as communications people to make this normative behavior, because that's how we change things. So I ask you as PR people to identify your client's green side, promote the sustainability features, use them in your marketing material, use them in your news media, even use them to attract new talent to your company. Because as more companies label themselves green, more people believe that this is important. And finally, after this is over, I encourage you to stay connected to Growing Climate Solutions or any other organization that's tackling climate change. Consider becoming a climate ambassador, learning more, being able to communicate these messages more eloquently. And finally, become a climate issue voter. So with that, I thank you. I'll stop sharing and I'll take any questions. I hope that this has been helpful.
That was great. Thank you, Anna. So we do have some questions. How has the pandemic affected climate indirectly?
The pandemic has done both good and bad. Initially, one of the interesting things that came out of the pandemic is that when the lockdowns came, the greenhouse gas emissions and the economic slowdown came, the greenhouse gas emissions dropped about 11%. In fact, if we could keep that drop permanently without the economic impact, we would be able to meet the climate Paris Accord agreements just that way. Unfortunately, as we've reopened, those greenhouse gas emissions have perked back up in a strong way. But initially, what it showed us is that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and really impact things. Also, as people have spent more time home, we may be changing our conventions about commuting. And since transportation is a big piece of the equation, if we can get less people on the road and less people burning fossil fuel, that will be a really strong driver. Also, it has recalibrated people's work-life balance. A lot of people started gardening. A lot of people started spending time outdoors because you couldn't go to an indoor venue. And there is a renewed appreciation for taking a walk on the greenway or just spending time in natural places. And that creates more advocacy for preserving these places. So that's all the good stuff. The bad stuff is that companies have been under a lot of financial stress. They've been laying off people. They don't have the money to invest in solar, or they're so busy trying to keep their clients and their customers and their revenue that they just don't have the bandwidth to introduce new recycling or a new initiative. And that's hard. So we're hoping as we come out of this that they can see the economic prospects of the benefit of adopting these things while seeing the economic growth.
Great, thank you. Next question. Has the change in political administration nationally, putting a greater emphasis on climate change, had any impact locally? And do you have any examples?
I do think that we are seeing some kind of impact, and we haven't felt it yet, but we will be seeing it in the future. We will have more federal dollars available through grants to do some of this climate adaptation and infrastructure. We need that money because these projects are hugely expensive. And so the fact that the federal government, through the Army Corps of Engineers, through NOAA, through community block grants, are going to open up the faucet in terms of grant applications to elevate roads, to do the pump systems. That's all. We need that federal and state money to implement the change. And that's really important. They're also taking the lead in putting the science back in front. During the last administration, the budgets of some of the data gathering agencies were slashed enormously. NASA satellites were taken offline. We weren't getting the continuity of the data sets that we need to track. So money coming back into these science organizations, NASA, NOAA, that is, even though it's at the federal level, it gives us the data that allows us to plot how much sea level rise we're anticipating. We need to, the devil's in the details, and the models are only as good as the data. So keeping that data going is hugely important, even down to the local level. So when the local stormwater engineer tries to decide how deep to dig that retention pond, he needs a rain forecast, and that rain forecast depends on the data. So yes, it's a trickle down, but the money coming back both into the science and into the resiliency is really critical.
Thank you. How can we or our organizations become climate ambassadors? What is the commitment, and is there a cost?
So you can be a climate advocate and ambassador starting today by just taking the first step to learn about more climate information and using your pulpit, whether you have your own personal Facebook or Twitter account, whether you represent that for a company and want to pitch to them, hey, we should do some green actions, and then we can use that in our branding. So you can start today. In terms of joining Growing Climate Solutions, we're looking for those partners, diverse types of companies, whether they're insurance or banking or doctors or landscapers. We are looking for companies to join our organization, lend their name, and then I can work with them by doing climate presentations or connecting them, a landscaper with a group that wants to do more native planting, and I can make those connections. There is no cost to joining Growing Climate Solutions. We're a free and open organization. What we ask for a commitment is a commitment to the principles of educating people on climate, taking a leadership position by talking about climate with others. If you are the management company at Gray Oaks or another big country club, well, bring that to your board. What can they do different in their dining room? What can they do different on their golf course? We want people to talk about climate change, and then if they implement something, please let me know, because I will immediately reach out to priority marketing, which works with me, and to all of you guys, to your professional organization, to put that out there, because the next golf community will then want to do it, and the one after that, and then the gardeners will start saying they have to carry more natives, and it starts to create this snowball effect, and that's how we get real change.
That is all great information. Thank you so much, Anna. I think that wraps up our questions. So now I'm going to introduce you to our program chair, Wendy Fowler, who's going to talk about what's coming up in the next few months.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Cindy, for the intro. I'm Wendy Fowler. I'm the program chair for the PRSA, the Gulf Coast, and we have some exciting events coming up. The first one is May 25th. It will be another virtual event, but we will have COVID-forced social media and the future trends. We're lucky to have Brenna Kearney, and she is with Tom, Dick, and Harry Creative Company in Chicago. And yes, I said Tom, Dick, and Harry. And she's had 12 years of experience in driving and tracking tangible results in social media and is an awesome storyteller. So it'll be a wonderful program to join. And that will be a lunch and learn. On June 18th, we're going to have an in-person breakfast in partnership with FPRA, and we'll feature a full media panel for that. More details to come. And lastly, I'd just like to mention that this is our 20th year anniversary of the Gulf Coast PRSA. So in October, we're going to have a 20th anniversary celebration. Look for more details, but I am looking for participants if you'd like to help with that event. I sure would appreciate it. I'd like to see some of the past presidents all attend the event and help us really celebrate our 20th anniversary. So with that, if you're a future member, please contact Courtney Jolly at cjolly@thenapleszoo.org. And if you need any other information about joining our chapter, please don't forget to like us on all of our social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And with that, I'll turn it back to Cindy. Have a great day.
Thanks, Wendy. Thanks again to Anna, Rob, Eileen, and Sarah, and thanks to all of you for joining us here today. The recording of this event will be available on the social media that Wendy just mentioned. We're looking forward to seeing all of you in person again, but until then, please join us next month for COVID for social media, evolvement, driving analytics, and sustainability. Have a great day and stay safe.